Just like last year, it's going to be a really good free agent class for the shortstop position. And we've heard reports that the Giants are going to be very interested in that market. And we have Farhan Zaidi and Giants chairman Greg Johnson talking about how the team needs to be aggressive in the offseason to get back to being a very competitive team. So who are they going to go after? We'll talk about it next.
You are Locked On Giants, your daily San Francisco Giants podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome to Locked On Giants, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, where it's your team every day. My name is Ben Kaspick, and on the show we provide daily episodes Monday through Friday talking about the San Francisco Giants in a way that's data-driven and rational, but also simple, passionate, and accessible to all. I'm a former contributor for the baseball statistics and analysis websites Beyond the Box Score and Rotographs. I've been podcasting about the Giants since 2015, and I'm a lifelong fan. Thanks for making Locked On Giants your first listen every day. We're free and available wherever you get podcasts. Today's episode is brought to you by BetOnline. BetOnline has you covered this season with more props, odds, and lines than ever before. BetOnline, where the game starts. And where we start is just jumping right into the mailbag questions. Thank you so much to everyone who submitted questions on Twitter. BaseballFan5 says, which of the impending free agent shortstops, Carlos Correa, Trea Turner, Xander Bogaerts, Dansby Swanson, do you think the Giants go all in on? And do you think Crawford could actually move to second base as hinted by Gabe Kapler the other day? So I replied to this on Twitter. I didn't see anything about Gabe Kapler hinting that Crawford could move to second base. And so if anybody saw that and you want to pass it along to me on Twitter, that would be very much appreciated. But yeah, I mean, signing a shortstop would complicate things if Brandon Crawford didn't want to move to shortstop. But at the end of the day, you're the team and you get to make the calls, not the players. And Crawford should understand that they need to improve by any means necessary. And if that means signing, because a lot of the best players out there in free agency are these shortstops and the ones specifically that you mentioned here. So in terms of which of them did they go all in on, this is kind of a boring answer that I'm going to give you, but I don't think they circle one and say, this is the one that we must get. I think that they're in on every single one of those guys, and they kind of just see where the market goes. And it turns out that there may be a better fit for both sides among one of them. But the fact is they're all really good players, some of them in different ways than others. For me, the guy who just I would want the most is Trea Turner, but it kind of depends. Like, is there some other team or many other teams who also view Trea Turner as just by far the best here, and then maybe he ends up getting this massive deal, and then you can get a Xander Bogaerts, for example, who I might have second on this list, and you might be able to get him for like $100 million less, for example, and that might be just a better fit. I don't know. So I would hope that Trea Turner or Xander Bogaerts are kind of up there, maybe with Aaron Judge, as just the top targets for the Giants in the offseason. I think Carlos Correa is kind of almost actually underrated. When I looked at his numbers when the Giants were playing the Twins, they weren't that great, but he's really turned it around in the last few weeks, apparently, because he's ultimately having a very good season. And he's one of the youngest free agents in this entire class. I think he's 27 right now. He'll be 28 next year, and he can opt out of his deal. It's 2 years, $70.2 million he would be opting out of. But I like him as well as a fit. I think any of these shortstops you mentioned, Dansby Swanson is a different case in a way, because all the other ones are like impact bats, and I think Swanson is more of like a good bat as opposed to an impact bat. And what he brings to the table is just kind of elite athleticism. 81st percentile sprint speed, is second only behind Trea Turner in terms of this group. And according to outs above average this year, 100th percentile outs above average at shortstop. So he's one of these guys who's going to provide a lot of his value on the defensive side. Of course, I want my shortstop to be providing defensive value, but the thing is with Turner and Bogaerts and Correa, they're providing defensive value. Although with Correa and Turner, outs above average isn't in love with their performance this year, but they've tended to be good in their careers. And so I kind of lean towards this being kind of a fluke for 1 year. But the thing is, those guys are also impact middle of the order bats. And so I think that ultimately makes more sense for the Giants. So Trea Turner, Xander Bogaerts, or Carlos Correa, I would just love to see the Giants come away with. I mean, I'd love to see them get all three, but that's not realistic. 2 is not realistic, probably. But one of those 3 being on the Giants, my preference would be Trea Turner and then Bogaerts and then Correa in that order. So the next question comes from JD Young, the great host of Locked On Sharks. Check him out if you have not already. Asks, was last year the aberration or was this year the aberration? So it's a good question. And again, I'm kind of going to give you a bit of a boring answer. And I think that neither is necessarily an aberration. Although, okay, if I had to pick one, I'd probably honestly say that it was last year. I don't think that this year's team is like a 100-win team that just massively underperformed. They deserve what they've had this year. The players that they have on their roster underperformed to the point where they've deserved these results. And what happened was guys like Brandon Crawford and Brandon Belt, Darren Ruff, who was so good for them last year. I guess as I'm saying this, it makes last year the aberration, but they also deserved what they got last year. It wasn't like they just lucked their way into those results. They really went out there and earned it on the field. And like Crawford finished 4th in MVP voting. This year, he's not going to sniff anywhere close to even being in the conversation to get any MVP votes whatsoever. And I think they vote 1 through 10. So just a massive fall off for Brandon Crawford. Brandon Belt was one of the best hitters in the game the last couple years, 2020 and 2021. And then this year, total non-factor. But a lot of these guys, like, they're older. And you should expect guys to get worse as they get older, typically, and also to deal with more injuries as they get older. So it's been a combination of that and then just kind of defensive regression. But I think they've earned the results they've had this year. They earned the results they had last year, but it probably wasn't sustainable. So they need to go out into the offseason right now, and we're talking about these impact shortstops. There's also Aaron Judge. There's a lot of good players out there, and they need to bring some of them in if they expect better results. And then ultimately, eventually, they're going to need to start having some of their minor leaguers come up and make an impact, which they haven't really had at all under, this regime. They haven't had a true, really good, star level talent come up through the pipeline and make an impact, which is ultimately they're going to need that. But it hasn't happened yet. Hopefully, with guys like Kyle Harrison, Marco Luciano, and others continuing to progress, hopefully next year we're actually going to start to see some of that. Because a guy like Harrison, I mean, he reached Double-A and pitched very well in Double-A despite turning 21 in the middle of the year. So he's young and he's basically in the upper minors already. He has a lot of innings now in Double-A, so very much a candidate to break through and be in the major leagues next year. So coming up in just a minute, we are going to get to why aren't the Giants linked to Justin Verlander? It's a good question, and we'll answer it momentarily. But first, betonline.net is your number one source for all your pro and college football betting needs and sports info this season. Find all the latest football league developments, game matchups, news, and podcasts, including this year's Week 2 games, which are underway, and Sunday's coming up quick. BetOnline is also your continued source for all your sporting wagering information, including live betting, esports, and scores. The fastest and easiest way to check in on all your favorite sports and events, including MLB, MMA, boxing, and golf. Head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn about the trends in action. Bet online where the game starts. All right, as promised, why aren't the Giants linked to Justin Verlander? It's a question from Manny, who says, I would think that would be a good contract to sign due to not having to commit for so many years. And Manny, you're absolutely right, in my opinion. He is a guy who makes sense. And we've talked about Carlos Rodon and then compared what he's likely to get in free agency versus what a Jacob deGrom, for example, is likely to get in free agency. And we've said, a deGrom has very real appeal because it's going to be a shorter term deal. It's going to cost you more per season, but it's going to be 2, maybe 3 years, whereas Rodon probably deserves 5 years. And the thing is, Justin Verlander is a guy who's arguably going to be someone who commands an even shorter term deal than Jacob deGrom. And the reason for that is that he's 39 years old. He's going to turn 40 prior to the start of the 2023 season. And he's got this, it's similar to Carlos Rodon. And I remember I kind of got ridiculed by some on Twitter when I said Carlos Rodon and Justin Verlander signed similar deals, and that's because we should expect the production to be similar. And people were like, are you kidding me? Carlos Rodon is not the same as Justin Verlander. Well, he's gone out there and had a Cy Young caliber season. That being said, Justin Verlander is outperforming his peripherals by a ton. He's got a 1.84 ERA, but the peripherals suggest that that's not sustainable, and it's more like 2.7 maybe is where we would expect him to land. So look, he's not superhuman 1.84. I don't think that would last over a bigger sample, but the fact that he's done it over 152 innings is very impressive. At age 39, it's incredible. So yeah, given that he'll be 40, it's definitely a 1-year situation. He does have this $25 million player option because he reached 130 innings. The structure of that deal very similar to Rodon. So he'll essentially opt out just like Carlos Rodon, most likely. I guess given that he's 40, he might say, why not? I'll just take this 25 mil, return to the Astros, and call it a day. But he could probably opt out and get 1 year 35 million or 40 million even. So I would expect him to opt out. And the reason that I don't see him linked more to the Giants is simply that I believe he wants to stay in Houston, and I believe that Houston wants to bring him back. So if he's, out there and somehow, some way just wants to move from Houston to San Francisco and pitch for the Giants, then yeah, they should be all over it. But it just seems like kind of a perfect fit for him to stay there. They're good. He likes to win at this point in his career. I think that's mostly what he probably wants, is to win a World Series. And the Astros are having a great year. They're going to win 100 games again. And I would just fully expect him to go back to Houston. And so that's why. But if he were expressing interest in leaving Houston, then he definitely makes sense for the Giants. Jeffrey says, what is the likelihood we see the Giants make a legitimate, strong attempt to retain Carlos Rodon by offering a 5-year deal in the neighborhood of $120 million? So I don't know, because I really thought that they were going to bring back Kevin Gausman. And then Gausman says, after he ended up signing with the Blue Jays, that the Giants never made him an offer. And I've kind of explained that away by saying he probably expressed that he wasn't interested in like a shorter term deal at a higher average annual value. He wanted to maximize dollars, is probably what he wanted. And for good reason. He should do that. And the Giants, it's not by what I'm saying is the fact that they didn't make him an offer doesn't mean they had no interest in him. It more so means maybe at what they knew he was going to get, they didn't want to do that. And so for Rodon, it's hard for me to say that they're going to just completely act differently than they did with Kevin Gausman. And maybe their preference is these guys like Justin Verlander and Jacob deGrom on shorter term deals when you can get, just like they passed up Kevin Gausman and got Carlos Rodon. They could pass up Carlos Rodon and get Jacob deGrom or somebody else. There aren't that many guys who kind of fall into that category. I've got the full list of free agent pitchers pulled up here. deGrom is probably numero uno for me in terms of a guy who would make a ton of sense for the Giants. But the Mets and their owner are willing to spend a lot of money, and I think that they're going to try to bring him back. And it's similar to Verlander. I honestly, I think it's a little bit different. I think maybe he could be swayed, but maybe I'm wrong. I honestly have no idea. But your question is, will they make him a legitimate strong? What is the likelihood? I don't know. Maybe 33% to 50%, somewhere in that neighborhood. I'm certainly not sold on it because I really thought they were going to do that with Gausman. And I don't necessarily see why it's that different of a situation. It's pretty much the same exact situation, unless they have some high level kind of data telling them that Gausman was not going to age well and that Rodon will. I have no idea. But yeah, that's the way I see it. All right, coming up in just a second, a question about the comments that we talked about yesterday by Giants chairman Greg Johnson, who basically said, we're going to do what it takes to be a competitive team. Does that mean they're leveraging the expanded playoffs and they just want to be a team that competes for a wild card spot as opposed to a team that competes with the Dodgers at the top of the division as a heavyweight powerhouse each and every year? So we'll get into that in just a second. But first, all right, as promised, this question about Greg Johnson comes from Cobert Gobert, who says, given what you mentioned in Thursday's episode, do you think it's fair to say that Giants ownership is one who is strongly leveraging expanded playoffs and other such rules to build a good but not dominant team to make the playoffs every year? You can look at the recent payroll trends, Johnson's comments of 175, 180 million payroll being high when it isn't, and his comments that the goal is to break even every year rather than to win a World Series. So, in other words, suggesting the business model is to make a team that will never be out of it in any year, but also a team that won't necessarily be a division-winning favorite by design, a team that brings a lot of fans to the stadium, but never actively goes over the top. Under my assumption, the Giants would be happy to be in the division race for as long as they can, ultimately make the playoffs, but then not really care or react if they get bounced early. All of this with a payroll that isn't the highest, but at least above league average. So apologies for the long-winded question, but there's a lot of points in here that I wanted to get to. And so I see questions like this a lot, and I see responses to these comments a lot. Like when I make my video yesterday, a lot of people have this response. And I think that you're on to something. But at the same time, what I'm going to point you to is, for example, the Tampa Bay Rays and Cleveland Guardians. And the reason I'm pointing you to those teams is that when you look at over the last 5 years, 4 years, 3 years, if you look at like who are the very best teams in baseball, number one, you're going to find the Dodgers. Number two, you're finding the Tampa Bay Rays as the team that has won the second most games in baseball. I don't have this pulled up, but I was just looking, I think, yesterday. I was looking because, criticism of this front office. I was trying to see what have they done under Farhan Zaidi. And the Giants, I think, were 9th in terms of most wins since Farhan Zaidi came in 2019. So it hasn't been even, but ultimately they have the 9th most wins in baseball over that stretch, I believe. I don't have it pulled up right now. But again, you're going to see Tampa Bay number 2. And I'm not saying the Giants are now the Tampa Bay Rays, but the Rays spend like nothing on their payroll. And so what I am saying is that it's possible to be better than what you're suggesting here. A team that's just like an 80, it feels like the insinuation is that they'll be comfortable being like an 88 win team every year. But I don't think that's necessarily true at all, because if you're spending $100 million more on your annual payroll than the Rays and the Guardians, who, by the way, are written off like every year, and they're probably going to win the division again this year. It is a weak division, but they have like a payroll significantly under $100 million, as do the Tampa Bay Rays, and both teams are going to make the playoffs. And so if you're the Giants and you're saying your ownership is saying 175, 180 million or more, I don't see any reason why you can't be a very good team with that kind of spending. So on the one hand, I see where you're coming from, and it is tough to be in the NL West when you are facing that team that has been the best team in baseball, bar none, over the last 10 years or so, especially in the last 5 years. The Dodgers have just become like, they look like a team that is going to win over 100 games every year. That's just currently the makeup of that team. And so when you're comparing yourselves to them, which you do when you're in the same division, And in order to get a first round bye, you have to win the division. Even if you're the second best team in the National League, Dodgers, Giants, you're still going to not get to skip that first round by nature of the new playoff rules. So I don't necessarily think that it's safe to say that, but at the same time, yeah, they're not out here saying we're going to do whatever it takes to win the World Series, even if it means we're losing a ton of money every year. But I don't think there's a lot of teams that are operating that way. The Dodgers have the highest attendance in the game. Their television deal is the most lucrative in the game, I believe. And in terms, he's saying the goal is to break even when he's asked about the financials of the team. It's not like that's the whole goal of their whole operation is to break even, because obviously that's not an exciting financial outcome. So what he's saying is, in terms of what we spend on the team, we try to break even. And so the fact that payroll has been down, there's a good case to make that it's been down because of the pandemic and because of the time it's taken to recover from that, with fans kind of 2020, no fans, 2021, a lot of the season there was limited fans. And then this year, attendance has been down as well. And so, I don't know. I don't think he meant the goal of the Giants is to break even. Obviously, the goal is to win a World Series, I think. So, on the one hand, there's some truth here. On the other hand, I think that they can, if they're spending $180+ million every year, they can put together a pretty darn good team. And look no further than some of the best teams in the game being teams that spend under $100 million on their payroll. So the next question comes from Rick, who says 4 position players that won't be on the roster next year. So it's tough to say for sure, but I'm going to say one of Brandon Belt and Evan Longoria, maybe both, but I have a hard time seeing both of them coming back. So if I had to guess, I mean, it's tough because Brandon Belt has been better when he's been good, but Evan Longoria has been better now and isn't facing this knee issue. So maybe Belt doesn't come back and Longoria does, because there's this reasonable $8 million decision. It's a $13 million club option with a $5 million buyout. So an $8 million decision. They could also meet somewhere in between. Say, look, we'll give you $3 extra million on top of the buyout. So $8 million total. And then it becomes a $3 million decision. They don't have to work within strictly the opt-out or the buyout versus the option. So maybe Longoria comes back and can be kind of a part-time player. He does provide that stabilizing defense. Not sure there's a clear answer at third, although it could be David Villar. So one of those two, I'm just kind of picking out of a hat and saying Brandon Belt will not be back, given the uncertainty with the knee. I think that Tommy La Stella's time with the Giants may have come to an end here with this IL placement with the neck spasms, and it's just been a horrible couple of seasons. For Tommy La Stella with the Giants, especially this year, it just hasn't, they want to get younger and more athletic. He is the antithesis of that right now, and it's no fault of his own. I mean, he was a good player, a quality little scrappy player before he came to the Giants, but it just hasn't worked out that way with the injuries, and performance just hasn't been there. So I'll say that they cut ties with La Stella in the offseason. That's 2 position players. And then I think that Lamont Wade Jr., I view him as a non-tender candidate. He's going to be arbitration eligible for the first time. Performance just has not been there all season long. I'm not sure they can just keep bringing back the same old guys if they're not performing, and he's going to be out of minor league options. He's out of options now. So I'll say Lamont Wade Jr. not back next year. And then Luis Gonzalez. I'm going to say, ultimately it's not been a great season for Luis Gonzalez. He has been in a deep slump for several months after a very hot start. He's got a 94 weighted runs created plus. The defense has not been very good. Overall, 0.3 Fangraphs wins above replacement in 329 plate appearances. And I'm just not sure, they need to get better. They can't just hold on to a lot of the same guys. I think Yastrzemski is another possible sneaky under the radar candidate to not be on the roster next year, but if they had to choose between Gonzalez, Wade, and Yaz, I think that ultimately Yaz comes out on top of that group. But we shall see. Those are kind of the candidates. Jock Peterson is another guy. He is a free agent at the end of the year, but they've expressed a desire to bring him back. So I'm going to guess that maybe that happens and not name him there. So that is all the time we have for today. Thanks again for making Locked On Giants your first listen today. Now make your second listen the Locked On MLB podcast. MLB expert Paul Francis Sullivan brings humor, passion, and unique perspective on every team and the biggest stories around the league. Follow the #1 daily league-wide podcast, Locked On MLB, on the Odyssey app, YouTube, and wherever you get your podcasts. Once again, my name's Ben Kaspick. Check me out on Twitter at Ben Kaspick, Kaspick. If you like this show, please consider rating it or leaving a review, giving it 5 stars, or giving it a thumbs up. Thank you in advance, and thank you to everyone who's done so already. I can't wait to be with you again on Monday. Have a great weekend. Giants versus Dodgers. We'll be back with the latest on Monday. So thanks again for listening. You are now Locked On Giants.